Welcome to the Soul of Enterprise, Business in the Transformation Economy, sponsored by Woodard, building your ideal practice with coaching, education, community, and resources. I'm Ed Kless with my friend and co-host Ron Baker, and folks, on today's show, we are pleased to have the author of Your Body, Your Health, Dr. Jeff Singer. How's it going, Ron?
Oh, great, Ed. I'm so looking forward to this. I've been following Dr. Singer for a long time, so I'm a big fanboy. So
Yes,
let's
yes.
dive in.
Both of us huge fans of the Cato Institute. We have multiple Cato fellows on here, and Jeffrey Singer is one of them. Let me read the rest of the bio in and get him on here. He is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute's Department of Health Policy and Studies and the founder of Valley Surgical Clinics, Arizona's largest and oldest group private surgical practice. With over 35 years in private surgical practice, he brings a wealth of clinical experience to his policy work. Dr. Singer is also a visiting fellow at the Goldwater Institute and serves on the board of scientific advisors for the American Council of Science and Health. His research focuses on healthcare, patient autonomy, and unintended consequences of drug prohibition. His book, as I mentioned, Your Body, Your Healthcare, offers a compelling view for the future in which patients regain control over their health decisions and care, and is the main focus of our conversation today. Welcome to the Soul of Enterprise, Dr. Jeffrey Singer.
Thank you so much for having me. By the way, I have a copy here in case people want to see it. Your
Excellent.
Body, Your Healthcare.
Outstanding. Well, I have it on Kindle. I have it on Kindle. Yeah, absolutely. Plug away. We'll make sure you do that. So Ron and I are both fans of Jonah Goldberg, and he has a very interesting interview style in that he says the first question you should always ask an author when they come on your show is, "What's your book about?"
Oh, well, okay. Well, my book is about how we really. I'm trying to reframe people's focus on healthcare issues in general, the healthcare policy debate, through the lens of the presumption of liberty or the presumption of autonomy. And I got to give credit where credit's due. At my director at the Cato Institute, Director of Health Policy Studies, Michael Cannon, he once said to me a couple of years ago, when we get into the weeds on health policy, we have a tendency to end up using the same language as the people in government who regulate us, and we need to stop ourselves from doing that and train ourselves to think of actually we have the rights derived from us, just like I said in the Declaration of Independence. So when the government is deciding, for example, what medication it's going to allow, we need to remind ourselves the government shouldn't be allowing. The government is actually standing in the way of my right to self-medicate. And he said, we're all guilty of kind of falling into the lingo. So we need to every once in a while stop and remind ourselves, or else we can forget what we're here for. So about a year and a half ago now, Cato publishes its own books. We have a staff of people who, that's what they do for a living. They're book editors. They have a team that helps them with marketing and publishing. So these are basically English major types, and they put out a call for more books. And Michael Cannon suggested to me, he said, "Why don't you write a book, Jeff? You've been here a long time now. You've got a nice volume of work, nice portfolio of work." And I said, "Well, what would I write about?" And he said, it occurs to me you could probably link together all the different policy areas because I'm sort of a generalist, and you could put them all together by this one overarching thread that every issue you deal with actually relates to how the government is interfering with our autonomy, whether it's medical licensing laws or certificate of need or scope of practice or FDA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, so you could kind of reorganize and repurpose a lot of your work, a lot of the research is already done, and make it by that and put it together by that theme. And I thought that was a good idea. I bring up my own experiences as a clinician into it to help, first of all, illustrate, but also to make it more accessible. And I decided to also make it not too wonky. When I joined the Cato Institute, it's 8 years ago now, and what I think I bring to the Cato Institute, because we have plenty of people who know healthcare economics, And there are plenty of people who work in the think tank world, including the market-based think tank world, that have a background in economics, political science, law. Very few have a background in medicine. And if they do, it's rare that they're actually clinicians. They may be administratives, doctors, or academics. So I thought I could kind of bring this unique perspective as a person who's actually doing this for a living, and add another dimension to the work we already do. And uh, as because of that, when I joined Cato, we all decided, well, I should probably take the lead in certain areas that a health economist could easily do, but it seems to have more credibility coming from a clinician, which is why I got involved in things like medical licensing, or scope of practice, or FDA regulations, or the war on drugs, the overdose crisis. These are all things that, you would think a doctor who prescribes opioids might have something to say about that. Tobacco use and the war on tobacco, and tobacco harm reduction and the war on that, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the areas that I've been working in over the last several years. And so those are the areas I cover. I don't get into what's the best way to reform health insurance. That's very well covered by Michael Cannon and many other scholars at the Cato Institute. My focus is more moral. It's more ethical. I'm trying to have everybody realize that when we're having all these wonky conversations, do we realize that we're basically having a conversation about how the government is going to be basically interfering with our own healthcare decisions, and basically intruding on our autonomy? That's what it all boils down to. So that's my book, and it's a libertarian philosophical perspective from a clinician about these kind of issues. It's targeted towards a general audience, not a wonk audience. You can't help but get into some of the policy, and I try not to get too jargony. And I'm assuming that a lot of people reading this may not have thought about things from this point of view before, and maybe some of my policy proposals might seem like a bridge too far, especially when you never really kind of thought of it this way before. And that's fine. I'm not expecting to convert everybody. What I'm hoping to accomplish is that when people finish reading this book, the next time we hear subjects of public health or healthcare, health insurance, or whatever, that they realize that these are people in your federal or state capital having a discussion about what they're going to do to you, about you. And you're sort of not involved in this. These are other people deciding what they think you can do. And if I got you at least appreciating that, then my mission's accomplished.
Yeah. And you mentioned it's a relatively short book, but it is extraordinarily well researched and documented. I actually went to the first notes page and did the little percent check in the Kindle version. 30% of the book is footnotes. So it is extraordinarily well documented. But you kind of frame the entire book with the historical case of Mary Scholendorf, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and talk a little bit about the significance of that in the evolution of patients' rights.
Yeah, most people don't realize that now we doctors are taught to respect autonomy. You can't do anything or test or procedure or anything on anybody without their fully informed consent. And if they refuse, even if you think they're making the biggest mistake in the world, you just have to respect that. It's their choice. But that's actually only in the last 40 or 50 years, actually, the way we doctors are. It was until into the 1970s, doctors were very paternalistic, often kept information from their patients and did for them what they thought was best. And things began to turn around. This was my introduction. At the 1908, a woman named Mary Scholendorf, who was at New York Hospital. And in those days, we didn't have imaging studies, so it was common to do an examination under anesthesia so the person's muscles are all relaxed and you can get a good exam. And her doctor suspected that she had a uterine tumor and asked for permission to do an exam under anesthesia. And she specified, you could just examine me. If you find something, then you wake me up and we discuss it. Well, the doctor went ahead and found a uterine tumor, performed a hysterectomy. While he discovered it, she had all sorts of complications, but survived and was very upset and sued. And she won, and then it was appealed. And on the appeal court decision, writing for the majority, Judge Benjamin Cardozo of the New York Court of Appeals, later became a Supreme Court justice, said that in effect, I got the real words in the book, but every adult of sound mind is an autonomous individual, and to do something to them without their informed consent constitutes a trespass or an assault, and that Mary Schlosendorf was assaulted. And that was, now other cases came after that as well, but this was like the first major and really eloquently stated situation that started the ball rolling. But like I said, throughout most of the 20th century, it was very common for doctors to, do what they thought was best, regardless of what the patient said. And then I used that as a way into the book by saying, well, now we doctors get it, but the government does not get it. The government is the third person in the exam room. And every day, the government tells us what kind of healthcare practitioners we're even allowed to get advice from or treatment from, what kind of medicines it thinks we can take, whether or not it thinks that maybe it doesn't think it works, even though we want to try it, what kind of substance we can put into our body, even what kind of steps we could take to decrease the risk of some of our lifestyle choices. And so in fact, at the end of the introduction, I say, in summary, the government does to us every day what Mary Schlosendorf's doctors did to her. And that's the jumping off point in the book. And then I start basically cataloging all the things the government does.
Well, excellent. That's a great frame for and setup of our show. Ron's going to take you on the second segment, but I want to remind our listeners they can get a hold of Ron or me by sending an email to asktsoe@thresholdnow.com. Of course, you can check the website out, The Soul of Enterprise, where you can see show notes as well as previews to upcoming shows as well. Check out our Patreon channel, available at patreon.com/TSOE. There you can listen to the show commercial free, as well as the bonus episodes that Ron and I do each week. But right now, a word from our sponsors.
All right, welcome back, everybody. We're here with Dr. Jeffrey Singer, author of Your Body, Your Healthcare. And doctor, one of the first books I read from the Cato Institute was The Rule of Experts, and it was against occupational licensure. And you take that on in your book, and you make a really, I think, ingenious argument that it's not the licensing of doctors that protects the public, It's your board certification. Can you
Yeah.
explain that?
Yeah, sure. And that's another reason why when I joined Cato, it was kind of agreed I should take this on, because if economists don't have any issue with this, they get it right away across the ideological spectrum. This is like a no-brainer. But uh, they get dismissed. They say, well, you don't understand. Medicine is different. So maybe it makes better sense if a doctor takes this on. And the hardest one actually is when it comes to doctors, because people think that the licensing board protects them against this very vital, life and death profession. So I tell audiences all the time, I'm a surgeon. I'm in practice now over 40 years, and I have a license to practice. And let's just say after all this time, I just need a new challenge. It's the same thing every single day. I'm ready for change. Like in every state, I have to take about 20 continuing education credits a year to keep my license up, but it could be in anything. So the last several years, I've been taking CME courses in psychiatry, because I don't want to hear another course about how to do an operation. I know that stuff. So, and I've gotten suddenly really interested in it, and I've done some independent reading. So I decide, you know what, starting next week, I think I'm going to switch my practice to psychiatry. Of course, this is assuming I'm like solo practice and I don't have to okay it with my partners, but in this scenario. So I could totally do that. Most people don't realize that, but I have a license to practice medicine, and that license is very, plenary. I could practice in I could be a dermatologist, anything I want to be.
A brain
So
surgeon.
I could be a brain surgeon. I could start that tomorrow. Now, if people say, "Are you certified by the American Board of Neurosurgery as a brain surgeon?" No, I'm not, but I feel like I could do it. You want to give me a try? So that's the way it is. So I changed the sign on my door from surgery to psychiatry, and then I think, well, I need to get some patients. Let me go over to the hospital where I always do my surgery. I know everybody there for years, and tell them I'd like to be on the staff as a psychiatric consultant. So if a person comes in, let's say, as a suicide attempt, they can consult me, and this is where I can get some patients. So they refer me to every hospital has a credentials committee made up of members of the medical staff. That's how they get a hospital wouldn't be credentialed if it didn't have a credentials committee. And these are all my colleagues I've known for years, so it's a very friendly meeting. And they asked me, did you go back and do a residency in psychiatry? No, 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 no. But I've been taking, for the last several years, that's what I've been taking my CME courses in. Yeah, well, Jeff, we're really sorry to tell you this, but you really can't have privileges in psychiatry at our hospital unless at a minimum you completed a residency in it and preferably became board certified. So, come back when you've done that. All right. Then I'm thinking, well, most psychiatrists, they practice in their office anyway. It's not hospital-based kind of practice. So I could live without that. Then I get back to my office and I start contacting all of the health plans that I'm on, where I'm listed under the panel of surgeons, to tell them I want to be now moved over to the panel on mental health providers. And they have their own credentials committee. They got their own liability concerns and their reputation concerns and regulatory concerns. And so same thing happens. I haven't done a residency in psychiatry, so they will not put me on their panel for that. And then I realized, I better notify my malpractice insurance carrier if I get sued. Oh, the other thing I want to mention before I go that far, according to surveys, only about 50% of psychiatrists take insurance anyway. Many are cash only because they don't like the interference from the insurance companies on how to do their psychotherapy. I can understand that. So I rationalize, all right, so I can't get on an insurance plan. I'll still do okay. Then I notify my malpractice insurance carrier, and guess what? The same thing happens. And they say, well, we'll be happy to continue to cover you for any liability that arises from your surgical practice. But if anything, you get sued for anything you do in the field of psychiatry, you're on your own. You're not covered. So who protected the public from me suddenly becoming a psychiatrist next week? It wasn't my licensing board. My licensing board protected me from, let's say, a nurse practitioner or physician assistant who might want to do some of the things I do. The only thing the licensing board basically confirmed is that I went to an accredited U.S. medical school and that I did at least 1 year of a residency program. But all those other agencies would have done the same thing. Excuse me. And meanwhile, what protected the public was all these private organizations that have their own reputation and liability and economic concerns. and they're protecting the public from bad actors. In fact, if there weren't bad licensed doctors, there wouldn't probably be any malpractice lawsuits or doctors having their licenses suspended or revoked. So the fact is that we already have these independent institutions in place. And of course, some would-be independent institutions are sort of crowded out by the presence of licensing laws. There's no question there's a need for information on the quality of these professionals that we're consulting, whether it's a doctor or an accountant or an attorney or whatever. But you don't need a government monopoly entity that usually gets captured by the profession or occupation that it's regulating to make that decision. It's much more effective to have an open, competitive group of vetters. And nowadays, with modern technology, it's so much actually easier to get this information that you need and to share this information. So licensing laws are basically put there it's a protectionist policy. They're put there to protect the incumbents. And I get into in the book about it, the history behind it. And I didn't know this until I started researching it, but the American Medical Association was founded in the 1840s, and its mission was to get doctors licensed, because in the early 1800s there were, we didn't know what we know today scientifically. So there were about 4 or 5 very prominent competing schools of thought about medicine and what the disease, what causes diseases. In fact, it wasn't until the 1860s or so that the germ theory even became widely accepted. So there was different competing schools of thought, and the precursors of the modern MDs, they now call allopathic doctors, well, they organized the American Medical Association, and at first they were going to different state legislatures asking, because under our federal system, the states have what they call a police power to regulate the local health and welfare. So they're the ones who could license under the federal constitution doesn't prohibit that. That doesn't mean they should, but they're allowed to. So they were going to different state legislatures asking that they license physicians, basically arguing that our group are the ones, we're the good ones. The other guys, they're charlatans. You need to protect people from those other guys. And this was the early 1800s. We were a young country, and they were getting rebuffed repeatedly. They were getting, things like license. This is a free country. You don't need a permission slip from the government to make an honest living. Well, but there could be some doctors who don't know what they're doing. Well, they won't last very long, will they? And so they really didn't get anywhere. And it wasn't until the late 19th century, in the early progressive era, post-Civil War era, where the concept of licensing became something that wasn't an alien concept. They're already starting to see some occupations of licensing of occupations. And so the AMA they did everything legally. They got very clever. They created state chapters in every state. And they also merged with the homeopathic doctors, which were their major competitors in those days. So the modern homeopathic doctors are not the same. The ones from the 19th century merged with the American Medical Association, and they got to be called MDs, just like the allopaths. And they went to various state legislatures, and they convinced them to license doctors. And the early licensing boards consisted of members of the state chapter of the Medical Association. And in order to get a license, you had to graduate from an AMA accredited medical school, and then do at least 1 year of a residency program in an AMA accredited residency. And that's how you got the practice. Does that sound like a cartel to you? It sure sounds like one to me. And in addition to that, a lot of our payment models, right now it's all fee for service. And they even did that when they created Medicare to kind of assuage the objections of the AMA. Up until I think the 60s or 70s, if you as a doctor accepted a contract, let's say with Kaiser Metal, to be the company doctor, that you get paid, like a retainer, and you provide health care to the employees, you could be kicked out of the AMA, because the AMA's ethics were, we work fee for service. And to do otherwise makes us look like no more than just an employee. We're above that. We are a sovereign class. We don't work for anybody. So, and that also led to right now we basically have one private sector vertically integrated health plan in the United States, the Kaiser Permanente plan. Had it not been for those forces, a lot of the regulations would have allowed for a proliferation of not just that payment model, but who knows what other kind of payment models that could have existed. And they're different. I don't get into this too much in the book, but for example, in the Kaiser Permanente, they were the ones who discovered that FDA approved Vioxx can cause heart attacks. Why? Because they get paid up front. So they have an incentive to monitor the medications that are approved for risk, because they end up having to eat the risk because they've been paid up front. So they do sometimes a much better job of policing and than they would if they were on a fee-for-service basis where they really don't care. So I'm not saying that's better than fee-for-service. I'm just saying that it's the cartel basically prohibited what could have been a whole host of other kind of payment arrangements.
Sure, like you see with direct primary care now, concierge doctors that don't take. Medicine or physicians are the only profession, I think, that can't establish their own prices. There's like 10,000 billing codes you have to deal with.
You don't have to if you don't take insurance.
If you don't take insurance, right? But if you do, you're kind of stuck into that fee-for-service model, aren't you?
Right. And a lot of that was, I had nothing to do with it, and neither did any of my colleagues. This was, pushed by our predecessors 100 years ago. But they thought it favored them until they ended up they made the bed they're sleeping in now. So when they complain about the system, this is where it led.
Right. Well, Doctor, this has been fascinating, and folks, I'd like to remind you, if you want to contact me or Ed, send us an email to asktsoe@thresholdnow.com. And now, a word from our sponsors.
We are talking with Dr. Jeffrey Singer, and his book is Your Body, Your Healthcare. And Dr. Singer, we have had Mary Ruitt on, Dr. Mary Ruitt on previously, and she has written extensively on the FDA. You have a chapter on it. You specifically talk about drug lag and drug loss, and you say drug lag refers to the additional time that the FDA's proof of efficacy requirement forces consumers to wait before they may access a drug. Drug loss occurs when pharmaceutical manufacturers choose not to invest in finding new treatments that they do not believe can recoup their considerable costs securing FDA approval. Talk a little bit about the FDA, and let me just ask the question at the top level this way. Do you think in aggregate it has harmed more people than it has helped?
I think it probably has. I mean, I couldn't quantify that. But that would be interesting to see if we could, using econometrics, put a number on that. But the FDA was originally, well, actually, if you look at the history of the FDA, in 1906, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, and I could live with that because it basically was a Truth in Labeling Act. Because in those days there were a lot of so-called snake oil salesmen. They were selling stuff that was nothing but sugar water, but saying it was, something else, or it contained alcohol or opium, and they didn't let people know. So basically, Congress said, okay, from this point forward, anything you sell, we're going to test. And if it isn't what it says it is, you're going to be penalized. And if you don't tell them that it has something in it like alcohol or opium, we're also going to penalize you. And they created the Federal Bureau of Chemistry to do that. That evolved into today's FDA. Now, as a matter of principle, I don't have any problem with that because that's a legitimate function of government. It's to prevent fraud. So I'm okay with that. But then in the 1930s, and it's all in the book, the circumstances behind it, so I don't want to take up too much time on that. But basically, in 1938, Congress passed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which said everything from this point forward the manufacturers need to convince us that it's safe, or we won't let them market it to people. Anything that's already on the market is grandfathered, which is why most people don't know this, but you can get 2 brands of insulin over the counter in the United States today because they were developed around time of World War I. It's old-fashioned regular insulin and NPH insulin. And if you ask your pharmacist, they'll tell you it's behind the counter, but they can sell it to you. And aspirin, I wonder if they would approve it today. So there were a whole bunch of drugs that were around, and when the law was crafted, and you could look at the congressional record, the authors of the law actually said, nothing here we do is intended in any way to infringe on people's right to self-medicate. So even into the 1930s, lawmakers recognized that we as autonomous adults have the right to self-medicate. They just said, we're only trying to make your self-medication safer. Now, as a purist, I would argue, well, I appreciate your concern about my safety. And if you got some information about something being unsafe, I'm really interested in hearing about it. But still, it'll be up to me whether or not I proceed to take it. That's the way I would come at it. But so anyway, that was the way it originally was. And if pharmaceutical manufacturers wanted to sell something directly to the consumer, they required them to have labeling that would be rudimentary enough for a person, simple enough for a person with a rudimentary education to understand how to use it. But they also said, now, if you don't want to go to that trouble, then, you could require the pharmacist to ask for a prescription before the pharmacist sells it. So up until the 50s, drug manufacturers, they would make their own decision as to whether their product will be prescription only or over the counter. And nowadays, with the drugs being much more complicated than they were then, I would expect that a great deal more, they would make that decision. So basically, the legal team would say, this is complicated. If somebody uses this wrong, we're going to get sued. We can go bankrupt. Why don't we require, in our contract with the pharmacy, they can't sell it unless they get a prescription. That way it takes some of the liability off of us and onto the prescriber. And that's how it was done. And then, but these were the days before, we had the computer technology we have today. So a number of pharmacists were running into problems because they would sell something to somebody and they'd walk out the door, and then they'd realize after, that company required me to get a prescription. Because some companies would require a prescription for their product, and another company that makes the same product may not require it. So it's getting kind of difficult for them. And their go-to guys in Congress were Senator Hubert Humphrey, who was a pharmacist before he got into politics, and Congressman Carl Durham of North Carolina, who was also a pharmacist. So they talked about this problem with him, and Congress passed the Durham-Humphrey amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which basically said in 1951, from now on, the FDA is going to decide what's prescription only and what's over the counter. We're taking this out of the hands of the private sector. And of course, now you have a monopoly subject to special interest pleading and political considerations. And so that's why, for example, in the United States today, even though women in 100 countries could purchase birth control pills over the counter without a prescription, and the American College of OBGYNs, the American Academy of Family Physicians, the AMA even have been saying for 20, 30 years, you don't need to come to see us for this. You should be able to get this over the counter. It's still prescription only, except finally, about a year ago, the FDA allowed one brand of one type of birth control pill, a mini pill, which is very inconvenient. That's why it's not taking off. They allow that over the counter. If you got to take it within a 3-hour window every day, or else you got to stop, go through the cycle, and start all over again. So that's why it's not that popular. But the point is that when these things are put in the hormonal, the emergency contraception, so-called Plan B, which the morning after pill, the FDA approved it in 1999. At the beginning of the 21st century, again, all of these different professional groups are saying this should be over the counter for women of all ages, particularly, you want to avoid a teen pregnancy. And it wasn't until 14 years later with a court order, because the FDA finally relented in 2013 and said, okay, we're going to allow this to be over the counter for women of all ages. And Secretary of HHS Sebelius stopped it. And has to be for political reasons. It can't be for any scientific reason. And groups were upset about this, took it to court, and a U.S. District Court judge said, no, it's over the counter. So these are the kind of things that happen when you have a monopoly, especially a monopoly that's subject to political pressures and special interest groups. And so it's the same as with the medical licensing. Before the FDA came to be, there were other organizations that were vetting medications. In fact, to its credit, the AMA, which I just finished trashing, they had set up the Council on Chemistry and Pharmacy in the beginning of the 20th century. And they said to the pharmaceutical companies, if you want us to designate you as a quote unquote ethical pharmaceutical company, you have to submit your products to us for testing. And if you don't, then not only we will not call you ethical, but you can't advertise your products in any of the numerous medical journals that we publish.
Wow.
That our doctors won't even have easy access to knowledge of your product.
Yeah.
So some of the major ones that we know of, like Pfizer, they all did that. And that was just one. There were several other organizations that were doing vetting. So it's not like we need a government monopoly to do this. And if people say, yeah, but we could trust the government monopoly to do it. Oh, can you?
Well, this leads me to my next question. We got about 4 minutes left in this segment, and just connecting Director of Health and Human Services, Secretary Sebelius, with the report that you did with Terence Keeley and Butasio Vivanco. Is that correct?
Bautista
Vivanco, on the current Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy. Just briefly, we got about 3 minutes left in this segment. Talk about that. We'll put a link in the show notes to this piece as well.
Okay, well, we all know RFK has believed for years that ultra-processed foods and some other things, cell phones, these are the cause of all the problems we have today. So President Trump issued an executive order telling him to, within 100 days, come up with sort of like a big policy analysis outlining where the HHS is going to go on this, called the MAHA report. It came out on May 22nd. And I looked it over with my colleagues from the Cato Institute, Terence Keeley and Bautista Vivanco. And it was, first of all, it was obvious that it's sort of like the Secretary Kennedy decided what the answer is and then tried to reverse engineer to make the facts fit his answer. We read it very closely, extremely poorly researched, most of the citations did not match the text. The data didn't match. And of course, the first thing that caught my mind when I looked at it was, look at who the commission is. Out of the 14 people on commission, 2 of them have a medical science background, Dr. Bhattacharya and Dr. McCary. The rest are basically lawyers, government appointed lawyers and politicians. And even the 2 doctors are government appointed. And as we said in our paper, what better way to get at the bottom of a scientific problem than by having a bunch of government appointed lawyers to look at it. So that's the first problem. But the thing is something it's not worth the paper it's written on. It's a joke. And it's a very complicated issue to study. And I'm not saying there's no role that ultra processed foods play in development of certain illnesses, but we don't know. It's very hard to study. Ultra processed foods are foods that contain a whole host of different either food preservatives, food colorings, additives. Some contain some of these, some contain others of these. It varies from food to food. The CDC lists 3,000, the International Classification of Diseases lists 3,000 chronic illnesses. So which ingredients in which ultra-processed foods are causing which chronic illnesses? That's really hard to answer. You're not going to do it in 100 days, although Kennedy says that by September, he hopes to have a lot of these answers. That's great. Nobody's ever come up with answers to problems that complicated in such a quick period of time. That's amazing. So basically, we published a report, and I'm happy to say it was about a 3,000 word document, got a lot of coverage, and got a lot of other journalists to start digging as well. And that is almost like a contest among different journalistic organizations to see what kind of flaws they can come up with in the report. So I'm very happy to say I think we started something.
That's excellent. It really is. It's well researched and really great to read. But we're up against our last break. Want to remind our listeners they can contact Ron or me by sending an email to asktsoe@verisage.com. Just a reminder that you can rate this podcast by going to, you guessed it, ratethispodcast.com/TSOE, and you'll be able to put in a rating and give us a full comment if you like. We will read those online. But right now, a word from our sponsors, including Woodard.
Welcome back, everybody. We're here with the author of Your Body, Your Healthcare, Dr. Jeffrey Singer. And Doctor, I've always wanted to ask you, one of my first introductions to libertarianism, maybe even before Ayn Rand, was Dr. Thomas Saz. A local radio host always interviewed him like once a quarter or something. And I read The Myth of Mental Illness. What is your take on his work?
He's influenced me a great deal. As you know, he was a libertarian icon. And I think he had a lot to do with reforming a lot of the civil commitment laws around the country, starting in the 1960s. And he's influenced my position. For example, you're hearing, it's a very difficult problem. A lot of people living on the street have serious mental illnesses. And there's an understandable movement afoot to say, we just got to put these people into institutions. And, I can understand that because, like everyone else, I don't like walking over people on the street who are talking to some imaginary person. But we have to respect autonomy. And he argued, and I agree, that you don't have a right to force someone to accept treatment. Just like when I'm a surgeon, if I say, if I don't perform this gallbladder removal on you, you could wind up getting deathly ill and come into the hospital and it's too late to save you. And they say, well, I don't care. I don't want my gallbladder out. And I have to respect that. Well, it's the same thing with a mental illness. So I have a problem with that. And Dr. Zaz, in answer to, well, what are you going to do about these people who are, for example, committing property crimes? Or, well, he would say, and I would agree, punish them for that. Even if you're hearing voices talking to you and making you have delusions about people that make you want to, let's say, attack someone, you know that the law says you can't attack someone. So even if you think that that person's a bad person, you need to attack them. If you attack someone, you just broke the law. So, and so therefore punish the person. He would argue that you shouldn't use the insanity defense. I'm sure you know about that, that you could say guilty and insane, but not guilty by reason of insanity. He would argue if you committed a murder, let's say, and you're insane, you need to be punished for the murder. And if while you're in prison, let's say, serving a life sentence, if you want to access the prison mental health facility to get help for your mental disorder, you should be, able to do that. You should be free to do that, but they can't force you to get treatment for your mental health disorder. They can only punish you for committing the crime. I know that's pretty radical, but to me that's a very consistent application of the presumption of autonomy and the presumption of liberty. And so I think what we need to do is come up with other ways of addressing it. First of all, another thing is freedom is messy. In a free society where we respect everyone's rights, we're going to see a lot of people doing things that we may find offensive to look at, or morally offensive or whatever. But as long as no one's hurting anyone else, or violating their property rights, that kind of thing, then we just have to come up with ways to accept it and live with it. But a lot of the homeless problem is not necessarily just due to people who are on the street that quote unquote should be in institutions. There's a whole lot of, it's multifactorial. There's a lot of zoning and land use regulation laws that make housing extremely expensive. And in some areas, there's shortages of affordable housing because of that. There are FDA regulations. I wrote a piece about 6 months ago. There's a drug called clozapine, which is an it's the only FDA-approved antipsychotic for the treatment of treatment-resistant schizophrenia. And upwards of about 20% of the people living on the street might have treatment-resistant schizophrenia. And it's been around since the early 1990s. But like a lot of other drugs that are psychiatric drugs, you need to monitor a person's blood count because, especially in the early weeks of taking it, it can cause reversible but serious side effects with your blood count. So the FDA had in place up until early this year a thing called a REMS protocol, where there were so many hoops that the prescriber, the patient, and the pharmacy had to jump through every week in order for the person needing clozapine to get the clozapine. That there was almost nobody nobody wanted to do that. So there's just a huge number of people who could have been helped by clozapine that it was just too difficult to do. And many other drugs equally as dangerous didn't have those restrictions. Finally, just as I think it was January or February of this year, the FDA lifted that after 30 years of restrictions. But that's just one example. So there are a lot of things that are contributing to the homeless situation, and one of them is mental illness. But I don't believe we have a right, again, to forcibly treat people for their mental illness. We certainly can isolate them if they're harming other people, because they're violating the laws that way.
Right. I read your paper, doctor, on the oath that medical students take, the white was the lab coat ceremony or whatever, the white coat ceremony. And I wanted to ask you this. We had on Dr. Wendy Dean, and she wrote a book called If I Betray These Words. And the general thesis was to talk about burnout, especially in the professions, because we deal with a lot of this. She thinks the wrong diagnosis. She thinks it's not burnout, it's moral injury, because doctors aren't able to live up to their oath of putting the patient first because of the business model of fee for service, the 10,000 billing codes, in-network, out-of-network referrals. But what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's interesting. I'm not sure I agree with it because, for example, in the course of my writing this book, and like I said, I've been in practice in this town a long time, so I know everybody and they all know me. And I've discussed these issues with my peers over the years. And I think most of them, and I'm not saying this as a negative to criticize them, just like people in any other busy profession, they get kind of just, all wound up in their responsibilities, and they don't spend a whole lot of time reflecting on issues like what's moral and what's not, what are my ethical obligations. So I don't know. I'm sure people like me might feel burnout from that, but I'm not sure a whole lot of, I don't know how many, and I'm sure you see this in every profession, how many of them are spending time thinking about the ethical principles behind their practicing their profession and their interaction with clients. Some may, but I don't know that it's universal.
Mm. And then the other issue that I love that you took this on. I learned so much from reading your book. The book is great, by the way. Absolutely love it. The certificate of need laws.
Yeah.
Do you see any hope here? I mean, you say as of 2023, 35 states still have these things.
Yeah, I think one or two states might be this session or might get rid of them, or at least part of them. But the entrenched incumbents are fighting to keep it there. For those who don't know what that is, basically starting in the late 70s, states said they thought this was going to reduce overutilization of healthcare and save money since the state and federal government were paying for so much healthcare through Medicare and Medicaid. So they said from this point forward, if you want to add, let's say, a CT scanner to your clinic, or you want to open up a new wing of your hospital or build a new surgery center, you have to go through a committee, which is made up of the incumbents, to say whether or not we really need another one of these, because maybe we have too many of these, and because there's so many, people are utilizing it too much. What they didn't take into consideration is we have a third-party payer system. So they were basically thinking that by tightening on the supply, you raise the price and you'll reduce demand, but people didn't care about the price because somebody else was paying for it, the third party. So instead, we have a shortage. They realized that in the mid-'80s in the Reagan administration, they repealed that law that was encouraging that in the states. And but most of the states that had it, the incumbents loved it. So 15 states, including Arizona and California, got rid of them in the 90s. But there's still roughly 35 states. Every single year you go try to get them repealed, and the hospitals, the main beneficiaries of it, they say, oh, no, you can't do that. And they're actually transparent. They say, if we had competition from surgery centers and things like that, we wouldn't make enough money to justify taking care of all these Medicaid patients. And of course, I've countered with, we doctors could say the same thing. Maybe we should restrict how many more doctors we have so that we can make more money taking care of Medicaid patients.
Right.
But that's the way it is.
Milton Friedman used to say, so you have to be paid to be ethical.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Singer, thank you so much. What an honor to be able to talk to you. Really enjoy your work. Keep at it. You guys are doing great work over there at Cato.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated the opportunity.
Hang with us as we do a live close. Ed, sure. What's up for next week?
Next week, Ron, we're going to talk about some business news, but I think we're going to title the show, We Promise Not to Talk About Tariffs Anymore, because we've been doing way too much of that. So,
okay, sounds good. I'll see you in 167 hours.
This has been The Soul of Enterprise, Business in the Transformation Economy. Sponsored by Woodard. Building your ideal coaching practice with coaching, education, community, and resources. Join us next week at 3 p.m. Eastern, that's noon Pacific. In the meantime, please feel free to visit us on the web at www.thesoulofenterprise.com.